Chandrika, welcome to the podcast. How are we?
I'm really well. Thanks for having me here.
I love how literally yesterday we were in a tall building in London doing some very like corporate things, sat at a round table talking about social mobility, and now we're in a studio together talking about mental health,
I know,
which is a
isn't this
slightly different conversation, isn't it?
the power of networks? So
It
hey,
is. It is. I'm really excited for today because I think mental health is such an important conversation, and it's something that I've always been quite passionate about. And I know that you're a accredited psychotherapist. I don't really know what a psychotherapist is. Could we start with what is a psychotherapist?
yes, really good question. So a therapist is somebody anybody can go and see. So you don't need a mental health illness, or to be honest, you don't even need to be feeling sad or depressed. You might just feel like I want to learn a bit more about myself, or my relationship feels a bit ropey, or I just want to learn more about other people and how my brain works and how their brain works. And I'm just curious. So it could be just an exploratory thing, or it could be actually I am going through something and I need to borrow somebody else's brain to help me regulate myself. But if we think of a therapist as somebody who helps you reflect, or somebody who reflects back your thoughts to you and helps you make sense of the stream of consciousness that we all have going through us, you probably notice if we take a beat and you just think about what's going on in your brain, there's thoughts constantly going through you. And it could be things like, oh my gosh, I feel bloated, or like, oh, did that come across okay? Or like, I've just stuttered, whatever it is. And I think because we can't escape that stream of consciousness, life can get very overwhelming. And, unless we are very good at mindfulness, we don't pause and reflect on what's going through our brains, what we need to pay attention to and what we can just let flow. So a therapist can help you organize what you want organized.
Really like that. I always thought that a therapist was when I've got an issue, like a challenge, like there's something. Because I think if you look at like mental health, even the definition of mental health, previously I was like, that means that there's a mental health condition like anxiety, depression, bipolar, PTSD. And that to me was like what the mental health conversation was. But actually mental health perhaps is more about like the day-to-day well-being. And you're saying that's kind of what a therapist can help with alongside some of those more kind of like serious mental health conditions.
Yeah, exactly. And if we think of mental health as just saying physical health, i.e., I've got a cold today or I'm feeling a bit tired, this is all on the spectrum of what mental health is. It doesn't have to be like a label. It doesn't have to be a condition. It could be if you're going through something serious or a bit stronger, but it doesn't have to be. It's a continuum and it's a fact of life. We've all got mental health, like we've all got physical
Can't escape
health.
it.
Exactly. Exactly.
The definition then of like mental health, and I appreciate we're kind of really looking at like the foundations of this, taking it back to basics. How would you describe what mental health is? And maybe if we focus this conversation more on the day-to-day side of mental health, because I feel like all of the other conditions I briefly mentioned, they would probably take up an entire episode itself. But from like a day-to-day perspective for the listeners, what is mental health?
Yeah. Mental health is your feelings, your thoughts, and how you feel in your body. It's all of that. And it's a bit of a false dichotomy to talk about mental and physical health as though they're two separate things, because how you're feeling in your mind, and maybe some of your listeners who've gone through anxiety will tell you it's a very physical, somatic thing, which means it can be felt in the body. So if I was to define what mental health is, it's your emotions, feelings, thoughts, and bodily experience on a day-to-day basis. And that could step into something stronger, like I said, so depression or grief or anxiety, where you might be feeling it in your chest, or you have gut issues. So some of these stronger mental health problems can manifest in the body, but they don't have to.
How can I start to understand my mental health? You mentioned like mindfulness there a little bit, but when you're talking about all of these kind of like thoughts and feelings, all of these things going on, like how do I start to actually recognize what some of those things are? Because I feel like our days are so busy and rushed and we're always like doing some of these things. How does someone actually just stop and go, actually, what is my like mental well-being right now? How do I start to become aware of some of all these like things that you've mentioned?
As somebody who's asked the question, you're probably already quite good at doing it. Because I think most people run away from how they're feeling, and we can punish ourselves. So you and I were having a conversation before we started this podcast about the start of my career. I started my career in teaching, and I would feel so nervous talking in front of people, and I'd almost punish myself for feeling that way. Like, how dare I feel nervous for doing something that everybody is doing? And then you're judging your feelings, even though it's a really normal feeling. And then that can stop you from getting curious about why it is you're feeling that way and confronting some truths about yourself, whether that be, I don't feel comfortable with who I am today. I can't show up and express my feelings because I haven't considered what my thoughts are in a logical way or in an organized way, or I'm ashamed about some part of myself. So I think it can be really difficult to pause everything and just confront the things that we think about, because we can feel embarrassed about them or we can feel ashamed about them. So I think the first thing to do is just be okay with things. Like, we all think strange things all the time, and you might have heard of intrusive thoughts, sort of phenomena where the most horrible, absurd thing might jump into our brains. And that's because that stream of consciousness can be chaotic. It's actually not always like a calm stream. It can be like splashy and like bizarre. And we've got to be okay with that. And particularly today, where we're like stimulated by so many things like films and like 2-minute TikTok videos or whatever else it is, our brains are probably on steroids in that they're probably thinking things in a much quicker, wackier way than maybe 30 or so years ago. So that's a long-winded way of saying anything you can do to be compassionate to your sense of self and your thoughts, I think, is a good starting point. And yeah, don't be weirded out by yourself, because we're probably all thinking something similar, or, it's a really universal thing to have that stream of consciousness. Everyone's feeling and thinking something along the similar lines to what you are.
Why is it so important to actively learn about your mental health? Like you mentioned loads of like things there. Why is it important to actually focus on them?
I think it's important because you get to learn about yourself, and you're going to live with yourself for the rest of your life, right? So you may as well.
It.
Sorry?
Can't escape
exactly.
it.
You can't escape yourself. There's some really interesting ideas about people loving to go on holiday because they think, oh, I'm going to be this version of myself in Italy or Spain or wherever it is. But you're taking yourself and your own anxieties with you. So until you start to learn more about your relationship with yourself, you're not really going to be able to escape some of these more sticky feelings. And to be clear, I don't think you can escape them anyway, but at least you can get to know them. And at least then you can learn how to manage them. I think the relationship with yourself is really important. And I think that's one big reason it'd be a good idea to work out what's going on here.
And what do you mean by relationship with yourself? You mentioned like your like self-identity and these things. Like, what does that mean to you?
Yeah, I think a relationship with yourself is probably the most important one we'll have. Similarly to the point about going away with yourself on holiday, you're also bringing yourself to every relationship, right? You're 50% of whoever it is you're being friends with or you're going out with or whatever. So your relationship with yourself, I think, is a complex thing, but it's getting to know who you are at different stages of your life, getting comfortable with your own childhood and background, and the fact that we've probably all gone through stuff to get to this point. So let me get curious about that. Like, what was life like before I turned 10? Or what was life like when I was a teenager, which can be a particularly vulnerable point, I think, in lots of people's lives. So it's getting to know our own histories, the way our brains work, the kind of people we are. Like, I'm not a morning person. So it's just learning about what works for you, what doesn't work for you, how your brain ticks, what motivates you. It's so many things, but I think those are some of the things that stand out to me.
Childhood experiences. So I have been quite fascinated with watching or listening to like a load of podcasts recently that talk about how your childhood, let's say from the ages of almost like 2 up to maybe like 10 or 12, create or have such a significant impact on what's wired into our brains as adults. Could you set the scene and maybe talk us through how childhood experiences can affect us as young adults and then maybe even adults as we grow older as well?
Yeah. So there are lots of people that say, oh, I've had a great childhood. I can't think of anything bad that's happened. And the chances are, first of all, that's a really nice place to be if people don't have like a standout event that's happened to them that's been traumatic. But the chances are we've all gone through stuff before we get to a certain age. And those formative years, I think, are quite vulnerable for us because it's when our brains are forming. And one of the key ideas that you might have heard about is attachment theory. So it's this idea that as humans, we need a solid attachment figure, a secure attachment, they call it, somebody who we know we can rely on, who accepts us. And if we're lucky enough to have that person, who, by the way, doesn't need to be perfect, they just need to be good enough, we can develop a worldview which is based on the idea that it's safe out there, people are trustworthy. And then from that, you can grow and develop into the person you want to become. And if that doesn't happen, then we are so incredible as humans because we are so adaptable and we can go on and find that figure in somebody else, whether that's a partner later in life or a friend or a teacher. We're all probably inbuilt to find security if it presents itself in our lives. But yeah, the attachment figure idea is probably a big one for this first few years.
And then you're saying that our brains are very, what's the word, like open or like neuroplasticity, is that the right word
Yeah, exactly.
for it? So our brains are essentially forming as we're younger. So is there a possibility then that at the ages of like 2 to 6 where we can't remember what happened in like when we were those ages, but the things that happened around us would actually start to form some of our beliefs and things that we think about now? Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. Yeah. How we feel about ourselves, how we feel about others. But you're right, with the neuroplasticity, we can rewire things. And that's, again, why it's important to get curious about what our beliefs are about different things in the world, even down to what we think certain words actually mean. If we break that down, we formed ideas about what different concepts are and what different words mean to us quite early on. And we can be empowered to change things. As soon as we start to learn about these ideas, we can start to do the work and change our attachment to certain ideas and sort of rewire and recondition ourselves. And I think there's hope in that. There's hope in the idea that we can change how we feel about things. We can change how we feel about ourselves and other people and ideas.
Can you share an example of this? Like, let's say someone's had a pretty average lifestyle growing up. They think, that if I look back at my childhood, it was good. I had supportive parents that loved me. I didn't have everything, but I didn't ever really go without, perhaps. What's an example of something then that may start showing up in the future, maybe someone in their 20s, that maybe they wouldn't relate back to the childhood? Because I can't actually remember what happened back then. So could you just share like one example just to kind of put it together there?
Yeah, so one example could be you never saw your parents argue and you thought a good relationship meant that they always get on, happy families, no one talks about anything too emotional, and you might then become, I don't know, you might then be in your early 20s and think, right, my partner and I cannot argue. This is what a successful relationship looks like. But actually, you've partnered up with somebody who is a bit more fiery, is all right to have an argy-bargy. And that to you is like a sign of danger. Like, this isn't what relationships look like. So that might be the first challenge that you have to your idea of a relationship. And you might start to rewire what you think success looks like in a relationship and realize actually conflict is a good thing, even though that wasn't modeled to me when I was growing up. I don't know how to argue well, if you like, with my partner. That could be something that you're then bringing in later on in life. And that way of meeting somebody else and like merging how they think compared to how you think, I think is a really useful challenge we can have in life, because the great thing about life is not everyone thinks the way we do. And so that can help us start to question these older beliefs.
So the not seeing conflict growing up could make us think that conflict equals bad.
Exactly.
And if I have conflict in my life, that means it's bad. But actually, you're saying that can be a really healthy thing for a relationship. What's another example then that people can look out for?
I think other examples are like what we think a good friend is. So I've spent a bit of time with 6-year-olds because I've got a 6-year-old, and we talk a little bit about what good friendship is. And And we've had to have a bit of chats about his boundaries and what he's allowing other people to do to him as a friend, like whether that's like, yeah, getting a bit physical or whatever else it is. And we've had to say, actually, no, let's think about why it's important to be safe, but how this might relate to sort of older individuals. Is their idea of friendship, is it that it's all over text or a phone, or is meeting in person important? So I think a lot of these ideas can be flexible. You might change your concept of a good friendship or a good relationship when you get to 30 compared to when you were 15. So it can be malleable. It doesn't have to be fixed. Even if you do learn to do things differently when you're older, it can change again when you're moving on at different life stages.
So we've got this almost uncontrollable childhood that can affect us as adults in terms of our mental health. As a psychotherapist, what are the common challenges that you see people facing from a day-to-day well-being perspective?
I love this question. One of the key things is identity. So I've worked with clients who grew up in like different parts of the country and then moved to London, and they have like a displaced sense of themselves. Like, what does professional me look like? What does it mean that I grew up with this group of mates and now I'm working with this group of professionals? How do I find my voice? How do I be okay with the fact that I have an accent? The world of work can be really knotty, and there's a rule book that a big group of society just haven't been given and haven't been told. And I always think it's a bit like the Hunger Games, that feeling of everyone else is tooled up and I don't have the tools.
I got nothing.
Yeah. How do you know about this? Who told you
Yeah.
about this? So I think it can be really difficult to work out some of these challenges. And I think the best thing to do is just learn from other people. We don't all need to have the answers all the time ourselves. So yeah, see who's around you. If it's not a set of parents, go and make some friends, find some mentors, because it wasn't supposed to be done alone anyway. We weren't supposed to work these things out in a silo.
From an identity perspective.
Yeah. And yeah, so that's the first big one. And other things are relationships. Our happiness is dependent on like the strong relationships we have. I think Philippa Perry, who's a therapist, she wrote a book called How to Stay Sane, which is really great. She's also written another book about parenthood, which I would highly recommend. It's called The Book You Wish Your Parents Had Read, or something similar. And she talks about our happiness being capped at the level of our like top 5 strongest relationships. And if I told you to like do a diagram of your top strong relation or your 5 closest relationships, it'd be really interesting to think about, okay, what are the quirks in these relationships? What am I happy with? What am I not happy with? And if you think about those top 5 people, you might think, gosh, I haven't spoken to 3 of these top 5 people in like months. And so, yeah, that can be a really good litmus paper, a litmus test about your own happiness. If we're feeling down, go back to those relationships and think about what it is about them that tells us about our own mental state. So relationships is another big one, along with like identity challenges. In fact, the relationship one is probably the biggest one.
Is that both romantic and platonic? Is platonic the right word for friends? Yeah, I've not just made that up.
Yeah, exactly. So family relationships, and you know, people come to therapy and think, oh, am I supposed to talk about my dreams? And like, am I supposed to talk about what happened to me as a child? And they don't really need to. They can talk about, you know, anything that they want. We can trace things back to those formative years because of the things we've talked about. But it boils down to relationships, and that's including with yourself, which we've already talked about. And then, yeah, your top 5 relationships and the health of those.
So it seems like human connection and relationships is going to be a significant thing that affects our day-to-day well-being.
Exactly. And to strengthen those, we need to know ourselves and strengthen our relationship with ourselves. And
how do you do that?
Yeah.
What does strengthen your relationship with yourself mean?
I think just being clear on what your expectations are for like a good friendship or a good partner, a good relationship with your parents or caregivers. What are your expectations, and then what do your boundaries need to be? How can you communicate your expectations? Who's able to give you what you need? And if they're not, how can you seek that somewhere else? So I think, yeah, being really honest with those questions, because we grow up with these ideas of like what a good family should look like, and like it's called the cereal box family, like a a mom, dad, and 2 kids,
Yeah.
which is obviously doesn't work anyway because families come in all shapes and sizes today. But they definitely don't come in that like happy, clappy vibe. Like things happen in families, and that's okay. And we need to be realistic about what we've got to then work with that.
What does a good friend look like? Because I feel like if I look at all my friends, I fucking love all of my friends.
Yeah.
What makes up a good friend?
I personally love a good laugh. So a mate who can make me laugh, I'm like, you are big on my top 3 list. I think it depends on the individual, like, and what they value. Like, I value loyalty and sense of humor, somebody who doesn't take themselves too seriously all the time. But that might mean nothing to somebody else. So I think it's individual. Showing up, I think, is really important to me. But again, to somebody else, they might really feel overwhelmed by that. They might actually prefer a text relationship. So I think it depends on the individual and their personality. But I think a question that we're always asking ourselves is, do you see me and do you care about me? We ask that of pretty much everybody we come across. Do you see me and do you care? Because it's a really universal human need to feel like somebody sees us and cares about us. And that could be as simple as somebody looking you in the eye. And you've got to be confident in yourself to look somebody in their eye. And that then comes back to what we talked about, your relationship with yourself and being comfortable with who you are so you can show up for other people. But that question, I think, is a big one when it comes to friendships and sort of generally with relationships. Do you see me? Do you care?
What would you say is the biggest misconception around mental health that you'd want to magically get rid of?
Oh, that's such a good question. Probably that you need to be unwell to see a therapist. So I'd love to get rid of this stigma around why people seek therapy and like the taboo around it. And I think we're getting really good at it, being okay with the idea that actually we don't need to have a problem to go and see a therapist. My husband and I have been in couples therapy, and like we've seen that as important as going on a date night, because it's working on yourself, and it shouldn't be stigmatized, and it shouldn't be stigmatized even if you're not particularly well and you are struggling. So I think it would be removing the stigma around mental health, and particularly seeing a therapist. I think that's a really good sign that somebody wants to develop themselves.
What should people look for then when they're going to find a therapist? I know we spoke about this on the kind of like the prequel for this. What does that experience look like? So they go onto like a website or whatever. I know BetterHelp's a really good one that I've used previously, or they can find people just kind of through websites and marketplaces. They then type in some information usually about themselves and what they're looking for. There's usually a couple like filters. I'm assuming this is probably different depending on what websites you're on. And then you get matched with someone, right? Like what happens then and what should people be looking for?
Yeah. So one thing I'd say is there are a lot of therapists out there, and it's really important you make sure that they are accredited. And what that means is that they have trained in that discipline, because at the moment therapy isn't a regulated profession. Anybody can call themselves a psychotherapist, but if you look for BACP accreditation, then that means they have gone through an accredited program, whether that's at a university or a different mental health centre. So first, look for accreditation. And the second thing is the therapist was probably going to offer you a 10-minute call, like a complimentary call, where you can just see if the vibe works, if the chemistry is there, because that's really important. Therapy can feel quite awkward. There are quite a lot of silent spaces, and that can sometimes jar people, especially because we're used to back and forth and regular conversations.
And then the therapist just stops speaking and you're like,
yeah, exactly.
do I have to carry on?
Yeah, exactly. Why aren't you speaking? Help me. So yeah, those silences can feel really awkward. So you need to have somebody that there's a good chemistry with, and you can work that out, like I said, through a 10-minute call, which most therapists offer. And think about their specialism. Like life experience is really important to me. Lived experience is important to me, but it might not be important to another client. So if they're going through an alcohol problem, they might want to see a therapist who understands what that's like and who's struggled with alcohol themselves. But it might not be important for everybody. So accreditation and somebody you've got good chemistry with, and then don't be afraid of a bit of trial and error. Like therapists can cost quite a lot of money, so it needs to work for you. And if it doesn't, it's okay to say like thanks, but no thanks. I need to find somebody else.
Sounds a little bit like dating though, when the like 10-minute intros, like, is this the right person for me?
That's a really good idea, Adam. We need a speed dating event
speed
for
dating
therapy.
for therapists.
Yeah.
Because I've had, I mentioned this earlier when we were on the train here, but I've had and been to like a couple of therapy sessions, and I've jumped on a call with one fella from Better Health even. And instantly I was just like, it's not my vibe. Like, this isn't it. And then in the back of my mind, I was like, oh no, but I'm going to have to stay with them. And it got to the end of the call, and then I think the app just lets you choose whether you want to continue, whether you want to find someone else. And I was like, feel a bit bad ghosting this guy. But I was like, it's nice actually that I don't have to just commit to that one individual.
Yeah.
I get to choose who is the right person for me. And you're saying that's around chemistry and that feeling of maybe feeling comfortable in those conversations and being able to be vulnerable. What else does that feeling feel like when you find the right therapist?
I think it should feel really easy, which is probably not what people are used to hearing about therapy, because people hear that it's really hard work and the first few sessions can leave you feeling drained. And it can be, but it should be the content that's leaving you drained, not the therapist. The therapist should make it really easy to talk about things. So I'd probably trust your body. Like sometimes our bodies tell us like, oh, I don't feel right around this person. That often is because that person is what we call incongruent. So it's this idea that their face and their body doesn't match with what they're thinking inside. So, sometimes people are nervous and they like try to pretend that they're not, or sometimes somebody's fuming and it comes out in passive aggression. That's what therapists would call incongruous. And what we're trained to do is show what we're feeling through our face and body. And if we're feeling relaxed and showing that, then that's perfect. So we should look for people who seem congruous. In other words, they are wearing their feelings and emotions in their face. And that hopefully is calm, which is what you want from a therapy.
Congruous, I like that word. I'm going to use that. What should it not feel like then? You mentioned it shouldn't feel draining. Like, what else should people look out for that it shouldn't feel like?
I've got such a funny story with my own therapist, one of my therapists, where she started eating in my therapy session.
We're talking like an apple, a snack, or like a full,
just a bit of popcorn.
Like
I was
like,
like I was giving her my life drama, and she was like, "Oh, a bit of popcorn."
She's got popcorn. Oh, that's so iconic. Actually,
it wasn't
the
popcorn.
fact that it is popcorn.
It wasn't popcorn, but that would have been so funny. She was eating nuts, but I was like, "You can't be listening to me and having a snack." So it should feel like that person is focused on you. They don't have on anything in the background. There's no distraction. You're paying for somebody's attention. And that's what the difference is between therapy and like talking to a mate. A mate could be thinking about 100 different things, or they might bring the conversation back to them. Sometimes people do that. They talk about their own story when you're giving them a story, or thinking about what they should say next rather than just listening to what you're saying. So a therapist should be focused on you, and you should feel that when you're sat with them. It shouldn't bring out a box of popcorn.
Yeah, love that. Well, I don't love that, but you just mentioned the friends then, like how like some friends will respond back to you with maybe their own story, and I feel like that's a way that we try and empathize through. Oh, you're telling me about that bad thing. I've experienced that bad thing, but I feel like sometimes that's not always the most helpful thing to do, is it? It's just to then respond with your own. Yeah, I have that too. But then I suppose that is nice that you can share the challenge and go, I actually understand you because of this. Let's talk about how we can support our friends with mental health on just like a day-to-day basis. Even this question makes it sound so formal, but what advice do you have for people to support their friends in having conversations around mental health and well-being?
Yeah, I think one of the most powerful things we can do is be honest about what's going on with us. The chances are we're going through something as well. And if we open up about that, we're giving the green light to our own friends, particularly with male friendships. There's this idea that men tend to socialize side by side watching football, or
so true. Like it's the shoulder to shoulder rather than face to face. That thing is such an interesting thing, isn't it?
Exactly. Whereas women socialize face to face, and I think traditionally women are a lot better at being open about things and cutting the small talk out. So I think the first thing, particularly with male friendships, is just being okay with being vulnerable. And I know Brené Brown's made that idea really popular. And the idea of being vulnerable is just the idea of being okay to risk things with what you say, and not trying to control what you say all the time so much. So that's probably the first thing. Like, you model it. You model what you want your mate to do. And if that means being more open, you be more open first. And then that gives them the green light to do it themselves. And then, yeah, I think I like a bit of lightheartedness. So I think somebody who's got, the ability to be playful is quite a nice thing to do.
So not making it such a formal, potentially sad conversation. It's how do you have that conversation? But it's almost like gallows humor, right?
Yeah.
That's like when it's like a situation where you shouldn't be laughing about things, but you kind of do.
Yeah.
And I find that really helpful when you make semi-inappropriate conversations when it wouldn't usually feel like a good time to be funny.
Yeah, we love a bit of dark humor.
But actually, like, that for me makes those conversations a lot easier. And then if I'm having those types of conversations with my friends, it almost helps them get through those conversations as well.
Exactly. And obviously we've got to read the room there. We're not going to make a joke about someone's dad passing away or something.
Yeah.
Like, that's not a ha-ha situation. But if you've got that sort of vibe with your mate, then that's what they love you for. So yeah, don't be afraid to bring in your personality just because the conversation's got serious. It doesn't mean they don't want you to be yourself. So yeah.
What advice would you have for, let's say I've got a friend and I noticed that they may not be okay, and I'm like, someone's a bit off with, I'm going to make up someone, Fred, right? Do I actually have a friend called Fred? I don't think I do. Sorry, Fred, if I do know you. I've forgotten you. Let's say Fred is, I can just see something's off with this Fred guy, right? What's the best way to approach that conversation? And I appreciate there's no kind of like one size fits all, whatever the phrase is, because it's going to be dynamic to you in the conversation, how you know them. But like, what's the advice there on how to approach those conversations?
Yeah, I think it can be really tricky. If it's something sensitive, you're not going to go straight in there necessarily. You probably want to find something you both enjoy doing together. I think walking's a really good one. Whenever my husband and I are having an argument, if we can go for a walk, I think it can be quite helpful. So something to distract you from the conversation itself whilst allowing you to keep talking.
Because there's no direct eye contact.
Exactly.
There's the other things that you can look at and do and almost distract the mind from the seriousness of the conversation, maybe.
Yeah. And I know we just talked about side-to-side socializing with men, but this is applicable to like every friendship. Going for a walk, there's a sort of neurological factor in this whereby the process of walking helps you sort of tap into parts of your brain that you wouldn't otherwise if you're sat down. So I think, doing something to just distract from like the seriousness of whatever it is you want to broach can be quite helpful. And just letting people talk. I think sometimes we fill in spaces and we're a bit uncomfortable with the silence, and we'd be surprised how well people can fill that silence, especially if they're going through stuff. So yeah, don't be afraid to pause and like let your friend talk. Go for a walk. That kind of thing can help.
I think if you're just outside in nature, you feel better anyway. I think it's just a nicer experience. And maybe if you're just like sat in a stuffy room. Exactly. What happens if you're supporting a friend through a hard time and potentially it's quite a bad time for that person, so you're having to give a lot of support? What about the burden on yourself then? Because that can be quite draining when you're trying to look after someone that's looking after someone that's going through something maybe over a prolonged period of time. What advice have you got for I don't want to call them a caregiver because that sounds again too formal, but the person looking after that friend? Yeah. What advice have you got for them to make sure that it doesn't become or take over too much of their own mental health and their own life and their own capacity? Yeah, I think have a really clear sense of when to stop the conversation or when you need to just be like, cool, let's talk about something else now. Because it's not always helpful, navel gazing or talking about something to the point where it's draining to both of you. And if you get stuck in a rut like that with a friend talking about one thing again and again and again, I think it's okay to move on to something else. And just be clear with your own capacity. We're not always ready to take on our friends' stuff, and that's all right. Well, they have to communicate that to their friend. So it's like, hey, friend, I can see you're coming to me with this. this isn't something that I've got the space for at the moment. Is that an okay thing to say?
Exactly. So I really want to hear about what you've got to say. I really care about you. Right now, I'm not going to be able to be the friend I want to be for this thing. So can we talk about it another time where I can be there for you? I think they need to know you still care about them and you still care about the issue, just not right at that time because of your own stuff and what you're going through.
That's probably a hard thing to say, though.
It's
Isn't
really
it?
hard.
I don't know if I'd. I think now I've had this conversation, maybe like I'd be more inclined to do it. But I think prior to this, that for me would have been like, no, I need to help my friend. And even
Yeah.
if then the action of helping my friend, I wouldn't have been able to do it effectively because I wouldn't have had the space and the time or whatever, or the mental capacity. I would have probably tried anyway. And that probably would have led to a worser outcome than just saying, I hear you, I want to help, but I can't do it now.
Yeah, and I think that's because we are not used to standing up for ourselves. I think it's a really hard thing for people to do, and people might not.
It's creating your own boundary, actually, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Unlike being okay with your own like limits. We all get tired, and we all get a bit of mental drain, and we all get a bit of compassion fatigue. And it's all right to say no. I think that's actually the nicest thing to do for yourself and for your friend. But we're not used to it as a culture, I think. And so, yeah, it definitely takes a bit of practicing.
It's interesting. I have a couple of final questions here. The time's actually flying by. I don't know how it's gone so quickly. We've kind of touched on this a little bit, but I'm interested to hear what the kind of final answer on this would be. But what does a good mental health actually look like? What are we aiming for? What's the end result when we talk about like a good mental health and well-being?
So you're still going to be feeling sad, unfortunately. You're still going to be feeling a bit ticked off every now and again, maybe more than every now and again. But you're going to be comfortable with that. You're going to be comfortable with the highs and lows of life, and the kind of things that are going through your head. And I'd probably say like a good sense of I can get through this and I will be all right. So a sign of good mental health is a sense of your own a belief in yourself.
And resilience by the sounds of it.
Yeah, exactly.
In terms of the confidence of, I know I can get through this. Is that like almost that baseline of, this is challenging, but I know I'm good? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly. And this idea that actually if I'm going through something difficult, it's not an end in itself. It's not a trap. It's not somewhere I'm going to be stuck. It's just something I need to ride and go through. And I think what comes to the end of that is a sense of hope, like it will be all right. So I'd say that is the pillar of good mental health, a sense of hope, a sense that things will be okay. But also, I think we're really used to talking individually when it comes to mental health. And I mentioned to you earlier that sign of good mental health is actually good relationships. So I would say good mental health is also strong relationships around you, people who are filling your cup and you're able to fill their cup as well if you've got the capacity.
So relationships, and then we've got this kind of like mental resilience that can ride the inevitable ups and downs.
Exactly.
Is there anything else?
They're really big ones, but also this idea that actually good physical health is good mental health. Like if you're not tired, you're not going to be feeling great. And nobody likes to hear it, but the exercise and diet thing, there's a reason people keep talking about those things.
There's a reason that they're so cliche. It's because it's fucking true.
Exactly. Like lift some weights, especially for my girls in their 20s and 30s and above. Go and lift some weights. It's so good for you. I think men have already got this memo. They already know how to make their way around.
Get jacked in the gym.
Exactly. Pick up a dumbbell. But I think I spent years doing cardio and it was fine, but there's nothing like lifting some heavy weights.
Strong body, strong mind. There's probably a quote in there
Exactly.
somewhere, isn't there?
Exactly.
What's maybe some passing advice on the almost like top or maybe like small shifts that we can do that will have a positive impact on our mental health? I know we've probably covered quite a few of them, but what's like another tangible takeaway or small shift that we can use?
I would say find something that helps you move. And again, we've all heard about this, but any kind of movement, I I really like Jamila Jamil's idea about exercising but not being bothered about what you look like and not having to wear like tight clothes to the gym or whatever. So get comfortable with moving in some way. Think about nutrition, and then think about relationships. So yeah, there's a blend of physical and mental there, because I think they have a really tight relationship.
Final question. What's the best advice that you've received or you'd like to give?
Like ever in life?
Just in like life advice.
So it's not really a necessarily advice, but it's a lesson, which is like escapism can be really good. And if you like reading or you like watching a film or whatever, I think don't worry about trying to tick all the boxes of trying to do mental health well. Like even if it's something that traditionally wouldn't be something people would advise you, go and do it. Like if it makes you feel better for a little bit, that's okay. So yeah, guilty pleasures are all right.
Yeah.
Nobody's told me that, but I think it's a lesson I've learned.
I like that. I was actually writing I was kind of writing some notes on Notion last night to prepare some like carousels, because apparently carousels are important for social media. And one of the things I was trying to reflect on, I was like, what's like a good thing that I can talk about here? And I realized one of the things that I've been doing recently is trying to do healthy things more often than not. So it's not putting pressure on myself to be like, I need to do healthy habits consistently every fucking day, week, month, year kind of thing. It's just in a week I go, on average, I want to be doing more good things than bad things. And I feel like it's a lot more tangible. It seems a lot more achievable. Like an example might be going to the gym. Personally, I don't find it hard to find the motivation to go to the gym, because I know that I feel great after the gym anyway. But for other things like gratitude practice or meditation, like I struggle to do that consistently. But if I set myself the goal, all you've got to do technically in a week is 4 out of 7 days to technically be more than average.
Yeah.
And 4 sounds so much easier than every single day, 7 days a week,
100%.
4 weeks of the month.
Yeah, I think this idea of progress, not perfection, is really powerful. So are you making progress? Yes. Does it need to be good all the time and perfect? Not necessarily. So some form of progress, I think, is better. And it needs to feel achievable, right?
Yeah, and I often find then that once I'm 4 days in, and it's usually Monday to Thursday, because that's the easier days to be more consistent, right, than on the weekends, then I'm like, I'm on a streak now. I don't want to ruin this momentum, and then the motivation's easier to access to do those things, but it always starts off at the start of the week with just got to get 4 days, Yeah. So that for me has been really helpful recently.
Yeah, that sounds good. But also don't worry if you just spend a whole week doing jack all. Like it's all right.
Take the perspective on it. Like, have I done healthy things more per week this month rather than days? So even if you have like a full week off, it's like, well, 3 of the other weeks this month I've done okay. And then I suppose if you are going for a challenging time, do it per quarter, per half year, per year.
Let's get realistic about this. We all like a lion and a bar of chocolate. It's all good.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, that's a really good point, actually, because I think even at the moment, I'm like, day by day, week by week. But even where like I'm injured and I can't exercise at the moment, which is really annoying. But then I'm like, actually, if it's only 8 months, I'm like, that's 8 months out of like my entire life. Like it's really not that bad to not do something for 8 months, because I'm like, if I carry on doing it afterwards, then on average, I've still done the healthier thing more. Yeah,
exactly. Anything you can do to stop that loop of self-punishment, like I want to do this, but it's not realistic and I haven't done it and now I feel bad about not doing it. Anything you can do to break out of that cycle is a good thing. And that starts with compassion.
That's almost the hardest thing as well, is when there's like the added stress of not doing the thing that was stressing you out. So it's like, oh, I'm stressing that I haven't gone to the gym, and then what's stressing me more is the fact I'm stressing about the stress itself. And it's almost like the secondary stress of the original stressor.
Yeah, and that's because we procrastinate because we want perfection, and that's not going to happen. So you may as well just do it, even if it's imperfect.
Yeah, I love that. Good final advice as well. Chandrika, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
What a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
If people want to follow your journey and find out more, obviously you're kind of an accredited psychotherapist. If they're perhaps interested in that, where can they go to find you?
So you can find me on a platform called Welldoing. I'm also on the Black and Asian Therapy Network. I'm on LinkedIn. Find me. Love to speak to some new clients.
Cool. Thank you so much.
Thank you.